In the film, we watch Derrick's journey as he becomes an activist. What is the connection between environmental activism and civil rights activism?
I mean, the becoming, I think, that we saw with Derrick, at least as we see in the film, is kind of a vocabulary. At the end of the documentary, he's talking about the facultative properties of wetlands and using this real scientific language. So it's kind of a linguistic evolution. But in terms of activism and even knowledge of public policy, being the experts, I don't think that Derrick or anyone in the Gulf Coast suddenly became this. These people have been the experts on these issues for a really long time. This is a centuries-long conversation which basically talks about freedom, it talks about quality of life, and it talks about man's will and right to exist, to develop their own land, to determine their own being, from slavery all the way up to what Derrick was calling the over-engineering and the overdevelopment of these lands. These are injustices to the environment, these are injustices to the people who live and work on these lands, and I mean, those connections have always been there since America was America.
The black people, the indigenous people, the recently arrived immigrants from Vietnam, Southeast Asia that live on the Gulf Coast live in the places that when we arrived there were the least desirable and the most affordable for us to go in and to figure out how to do our version of the American dream with the natural and other resources that were available to us. So therefore, just as you can map race and ethnicity along the Gulf Coast and culture, you can also, that same map, if you look at it, the next page will also show you where, the most compromised, over-engineered, right, fragile ecosystems are. It's no accident that the levee that failed in New Orleans is the one that's located right next to the blackest, poorest community in New Orleans.
How do we create not only resilient communities, but a more sustainable Gulf Coast?
One, enforce the laws that are on the books. I mean, the one big reason why a lot of these places become sacrifice zones is because governments and developers decide that they want to either not comply with a certain law that would normally protect these kinds of communities, or they would, just act like it doesn't exist. In a lot of areas across the Gulf Coast, developers are allowed to lay down pavement willy-nilly wherever they want without complying with National Environmental Protection Act or even things like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which says, before or any project that has federal funding, you have to make sure that there is no discriminatory impact on people of color. But in this nation, we just act like these laws don't exist, and people build where they want.
What is happening is that communities are coming together, comparing notes, and being affirmed or reminded, perhaps many of them for the first time, that there's a we here. And so we created our own regional philanthropy to make small grants to community-based groups. We started Bridge the Gulf, the Bridge the Gulf Project, to provide a platform for community members to share in their words.
The connection between environmental activism and civil rights activism was where, so the Civil Rights Act wasn't an adequate protection for Turkey Creek, so you had to bring in the National Audubon Society, you had to bring in the Sierra Club to say, hey, this is unique bird habitat, this is another reason why this area needs to be preserved. This is where environmental activists begin to learn something about civil rights, and at the end of the day, it wasn't so much about the labels of environmental activism and civil rights activism. It was about people standing up for quality of life and freedom and self-determination of their community.
Very well stated.